The rain poured down in sheets, battering against the windshield of the car as it sped through the empty highway. The road, slick with water, reflected the headlights like a shimmering mirror. Inside the car, Ethan gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his face tense with concentration. Lauren sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, though her mind was far from it. The tension in the air was palpable, but neither of them spoke. It had been an exhausting evening, the kind of night that felt like it would never end. They'd been to a charity event, an obligatory affair they both resented. But still, they played their parts, smiling, nodding, shaking hands with people who only seemed interested in their own agendas. The whole evening had felt like a blur, but now, driving back in the dead of night, the quiet was deafening. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the tires on wet asphalt and the occasional rattle of the wipers. "Do you think we'll make it through this?" Lauren's voice broke the silence, almost too quietly to hear. She wasn't looking at him, but Ethan could feel her gaze on him, heavy with the weight of the question. Ethan didn't answer right away. He focused on the road, his mind racing. He knew what she was asking. Could they keep going like this, pretending everything was fine, when the truth loomed over them like a shadow, waiting to strike? "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I really don't know." There was a moment of quiet. Then, without warning, the tires skidded. Ethan slammed his foot on the brake, but it was too late. The car slid uncontrollably, spinning in the rain, the screech of rubber against the wet road cutting through the air. Time seemed to slow, a surreal haze overtaking their senses. Lauren gasped, reaching out instinctively to grab Ethan's arm. Her heart raced, her pulse thumping in her ears. The car crashed into the guardrail with a deafening thud, metal screeching as it buckled under the force. The airbag deployed with a violent punch, and for a moment, everything was white, sterile, a world of nothingness. Lauren felt a sharp pain in her chest as the airbag hit her, her breath stolen from her lungs. The seatbelt dug into her ribs, and the world spun in slow motion. Ethan was silent beside her, his face twisted in shock. Slowly, as the air cleared, he pulled himself together, his eyes darting to Lauren, to the damage to the car, then back to her. "Lauren?" His voice was hoarse, filled with panic. Lauren blinked, her head spinning, trying to regain her bearings. She could hear the soft hiss of the airbag deflating, the faint sound of the rain hitting the windshield. I think I'm okay," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Her chest ached, her body screamed in protest, but she forced herself to focus. Ethan, however, wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed ahead, his face turning pale. Lauren followed his gaze, her blood running cold as she saw what he was staring at. The lifeless body of the other driver, still slumped in the front seat of the car they had collided with. The car had swerved into their lane, and in the chaos of the crash, the other driver hadn't stood a chance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The gravity of the situation settled in like a thick fog, suffocating any possibility of clarity. They had just killed someone, and there was no way they could let anyone find out. Ethan's hand gripped the steering wheel again, his breath shallow. "What are we going to do?" Lauren didn't know the answer, but deep down she knew one thing. This moment, this accident, had changed everything. They couldn't undo what had happened, but they could control how they dealt with it. And that meant making a choice, a decision that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. The rain was still falling in sheets, but now it seemed almost like an afterthought, a distant noise that couldn't drown out the silence between them. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality, his knuckles pale. Lauren sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the road, though she wasn't really seeing it. Her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. She could hear Ethan's shallow breaths, could feel the tightness in his shoulders, but it was as though they were both holding their breath, waiting for the other to speak first. It wasn't long before Ethan broke the silence. "We can't tell anyone. We can't go to the police." His voice was hoarse, raw, barely above a whisper. Lauren didn't answer immediately. She stared out the window, her reflection distorted by the rain, her mind spinning. What did he mean? Of course they had to report it. They had to do the right thing. But then she thought about the body, the lifeless eyes of the other driver staring into nothingness. And the thought froze her, gripped her chest in a way she couldn't explain. They had killed him. That was undeniable. And in the chaos of the accident, with no witnesses and no clear explanation, they'd both been drinking. If they went to the police, it would all come out. And everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built, it would be gone in an instant. I know, she said softly, the words tasting like acid in her mouth. But what do we do instead? Ethan glanced at her, his eyes wide with fear, but also something else, something darker. We keep it quiet. We pretend like it never happened. The suggestion hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Lauren's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't think of another way. What choice did they have? Their lives would be shattered if anyone found out the truth. She thought about the people who relied on her, the ones who counted on her to keep things together, to keep the image intact. And Ethan? She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, even though their relationship had been strained long before this. We can't just pretend, she whispered, shaking her head. People will ask questions. There's no way we can just... We don't tell anyone, Ethan repeated, his voice firm now, resolute. We'll say we weren't involved, that we were on the side of the road when it happened. That's all we have to do. It'll be our word against no one's. Lauren felt a chill run down her spine. It sounded so easy, so clean, but she knew it wasn't. Not really. They were already lying, already starting down a path that had no end. But even as the words twisted in her mind, she couldn't deny the truth. There was no other choice, no other way. I don't know if I can, she said, her voice trembling. She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, she saw how much this was affecting him. The way his hands trembled on the wheel. The way his eyes darted nervously around. He was just as scared as she was. Maybe more. You have to, he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. We both have to. It's the only way we can get through this. Lauren swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest like a stone. He was right, in a way. They couldn't undo what had happened. And if they tried to go to the police, if they told the truth, everything would fall apart. She would lose everything. They both would. I'll do it, she whispered finally, the words barely audible. I'll keep quiet, but we can't ever let anyone find out. Ethan nodded, his eyes dark with a mixture of relief and fear. We'll never tell anyone. Not a soul. They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the soft patter of rain against the car, as though the world outside had forgotten what had happened inside. But Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed a line they could never return from. There was no going back now. I don't know if I can live with this, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Every day I'll be wondering if someone will find out, if we'll get caught. Ethan's gaze softened, his hand reaching out to touch hers, a gesture of comfort that felt strangely hollow. We'll be careful, he said softly. We'll do whatever it takes. But as he said it, Lauren knew that whatever it takes would come at a cost. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing, constant reminder that no matter how carefully they planned, the truth would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to destroy them. And yet, they both knew that there was nothing else they could do. The pact was made. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, on the surface. Lauren and Ethan continued their daily routines, each of them carrying the burden of their pact like a weight around their necks. They had promised to keep the secret, to pretend that nothing had happened, but the reality of it was eating away at them both. Ethan had become more withdrawn, distant in ways that Lauren had never seen before. He spent long hours at work, coming home late, his mind clearly elsewhere. When they were together, he was distracted, his gaze unfocused, as though he were always on the lookout for something, or someone, who might expose them. Lauren, too, found herself lost in thought, the memory of the accident and the lifeless eyes of the other driver haunting her at night. She couldn't shake the guilt, the feeling that she was living in a lie. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the woman who had made a choice to bury the truth. And it wasn't just the guilt. It was the silence between her and Ethan, the unspoken tension that seemed to grow with each passing day. It was like they were walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from everything unraveling. Their home, once a place of warmth and comfort, had turned cold and silent. The intimacy they had once shared had slipped through their fingers like sand, leaving only the quiet hum of everyday life behind. They ate their meals in silence, exchanged few words, and when they did speak, it was only to discuss trivial matters, things that didn't matter, anything to avoid talking about what had happened, about what they had done. It was on one of those long, quiet evenings that things finally came to a head. Lauren sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug absent-mindedly. She had been waiting for Ethan to come home, but it was already late. She had barely eaten dinner, too distracted by the thoughts that were always swirling in her mind. The guilt, the anxiety, the sense that they were living a lie. It was becoming unbearable. When the front door creaked open, she looked up, expecting to see Ethan walking through the door. But instead, she was met with a figure she hadn't seen in months, his best friend, Luke. He stood in the doorway, his face set in a serious expression, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for something. "Luke?" Lauren's voice was tinged with confusion, and she stood up from the table, unsure of what to make of his sudden appearance. "What are you doing here?" Luke's gaze flickered for a moment, his eyes shifting away before he locked them back onto hers. "Ethan's not here?" he asked, his voice low, almost too quiet. "No, he's working late again," Lauren replied, her heart starting to race. Something about Luke's demeanor was off, like he knew more than he was letting on. "Is everything okay?" Luke hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, as though he were unsure of what to say. Finally, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lauren's stomach twisted with a sense of dread. She motioned for him to sit, her pulse quickening. "What is it, Luke? Is something wrong?" He sat down at the table, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's about the accident," he said, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. For a moment it felt like the world stopped. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind raced, trying to process what Luke had just said. How could he know? They had been so careful, so determined to bury the truth. "I know what happened that night," Luke continued, his voice steady. But there was an edge to it now, a quiet intensity that made Lauren's heart race even faster. "I know you and Ethan were involved." Lauren's world tilted. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. What are you talking about?" she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would give away their secret. Luke leaned forward, his expression serious. "Don't lie to me, Lauren," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of concern and something darker, something almost accusatory. "I've seen the way Ethan's been acting, and I've been talking to some people. They're asking questions. People are starting to wonder about what really happened that night." Lauren's mind raced. She had never seen Luke like this, so certain, so confident in what he was saying. Her pulse quickened as she tried to keep her composure. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking, though she hated how weak it sounded. Luke's eyes softened for a moment, but the seriousness remained. "I know you're trying to protect him," he said gently, "but you can't keep this buried forever. People will find out." And when they do, it won't just be Ethan's life that's ruined. It'll be yours too. Lauren sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Luke's words struck a chord deep within her. She had known it all along, that the lie they were living was unsustainable. But hearing Luke say it out loud, hearing the certainty in his voice, made it feel real. Too real. You have to be careful, Luke continued. There's a lot more at stake here than you realize. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. She felt trapped, caught in a web of lies and secrets, with no clear way out. She had already made a choice, and now it seemed there was no going back. The days after Luke's visit felt like a blur to Lauren. His words had haunted her, echoing in her mind at every turn. You can't keep this buried forever. They replayed in an endless loop, each repetition deepening her sense of panic. She hadn't expected Luke to be the one to uncover the truth, but now that the secret was on the verge of slipping out, she couldn't help but feel as though the walls were closing in around her. Ethan had barely spoken to her in the past few days. He was still coming home late, still distant, but there was something else in the air now, a sense of unease that neither of them could shake. Every glance felt loaded with unspoken words. They both knew that something had to give. Lauren tried to keep her composure. She maintained the facade of a normal life, going about her day with a smile that she no longer felt. But the truth was that she felt like she was drowning. She couldn't even look at Ethan without the overwhelming weight of their shared secret threatening to consume her. That afternoon, she found herself pacing in their living room, unable to sit still. She had to confront him. It was the only way to move forward. The thought of continuing to live in this limbo, of keeping up the charade, was unbearable. She hadn't planned what she would say, but the words were already forming in her mind, her heart pounding in anticipation of the conversation to come. She had to be honest, no matter how much it hurt. When Ethan finally walked through the door that evening, his face drawn, his eyes tired, Lauren felt a cold knot form in her stomach. He was trying to avoid her again, but not tonight. "Ethan," she said, her voice firm, though it trembled slightly as she spoke his name. He froze in the doorway, clearly surprised by the tone of her voice. "Lauren, what's wrong?" His hand hovered over the door handle, as though he were ready to turn around and leave, but something in her gaze stopped him. He studied her for a moment, his expression shifting from confusion to wariness. "We need to talk," Lauren said, her heart racing in her chest. "About everything." Ethan's shoulders tensed. He knew exactly what she meant. The silence between them. The distance. It had all been building up to this moment. He stepped further into the room, closing the door softly behind him, as though trying to shut out the world outside. "I don't know what to say, Lauren," he muttered, his voice low. "I don't know how to fix this." Lauren took a deep breath, gathering the courage to finally speak the truth. "We can't keep running from it, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been living a lie. We made a pact, but it's tearing us apart." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt flickering across his face. "I know," he said, his voice strained. "I know. But I didn't think it would end up like this. I thought we could go back to normal. I thought we could bury it and move on." "We can't," Lauren replied sharply, her voice gaining strength. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen. We need to face it, Ethan. We need to deal with what we did." There was a long pause, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. Ethan stood there looking at her, as though searching for some kind of escape in her eyes. But there was none. This was the moment they had been avoiding for so long, the moment when everything changed. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been trying to protect you. I didn't want this to destroy us." Lauren felt a rush of emotion swell inside her, relief, anger, fear, all of it crashing over her like a wave. For so long, she had carried this burden alone, but now, In this moment, she realized something. They had to face it together, or they would lose everything. "We can't keep protecting each other by running away," Lauren said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "We need to tell the truth. We need to find a way to fix this before it destroys us." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing her words, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but strained. "I know. I don't know if it's too late." Lauren's heart skipped a beat. Too late? Was it really too late to fix everything? Was there still a chance for them to come back from this? The silence that followed felt suffocating, like a heavy fog settling between them. Ethan's words had struck a chord deep within her. She didn't want to believe it was too late, but a part of her feared that they had already crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The secret, the guilt, it had taken root in their lives, poisoning everything in its wake. As the minutes passed in heavy silence, Lauren knew there was no turning back. They couldn't just walk away from this. Whatever happened next, they had to face it together. But even as she made that decision, something else tugged at her. An unsettling feeling that their troubles were only just beginning. The world they had been trying to protect, the life they had been trying to save, was about to unravel in ways neither of them could have anticipated. "Whatever happens next, we're in this together," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "But we have to be honest. We can't keep living this lie." Ethan didn't reply right away. He simply nodded, his eyes dark with emotion. The weight of their pact had finally come crashing down on them. The truth was no longer something they could hide from. It was something they had to face, no matter the cost. The days after their confrontation passed in a blur, each moment heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Ethan and Lauren had decided, in the silence of their shared pain, that they would tell the truth. But as the days wore on, it became clear that their decision came with consequences neither of them had anticipated. Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers, something important. Their world, so carefully constructed, so fragile, was beginning to unravel. The secret they'd sworn to protect, the one that had bound them together in the first place, had become a ticking time bomb. The longer they waited to confront it, the more it seemed to eat away at them from the inside. She had spent the last few nights awake, staring at the ceiling, the cold weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Luke's face, his piercing gaze, his cryptic warnings. "You can't keep this buried forever." She tried to push the thought aside, but it stuck with her, clinging like a shadow, lurking at the edges of her thoughts. She hadn't wanted to admit it to herself, but the truth was becoming too big to ignore. If they didn't act soon, the consequences of their silence would be far worse than anything they had imagined. One evening, as the golden light of dusk spilled into the room, Ethan came home earlier than usual. He hadn't said much since their last conversation, and Lauren wasn't sure what to expect when he stepped through the door. She had been pacing again, trying to work through the feelings of dread that had taken over her mind. "Lauren," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected him to speak. He looked tired. His eyes were hollow, his face drawn tight with worry. "We can't wait any longer," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "We have to do something about this. It's eating away at me. It's eating away at both of us." Lauren's heart skipped a beat. She had known this was coming. The conversation, the truth, had to come to light. But hearing him say it out loud made the reality of their situation hit harder than ever before. "I know," Lauren replied, her voice shaking with the gravity of their words. "I've been thinking the same thing, but we don't even know where to start. We don't know who to trust, Ethan. What if telling the truth makes everything worse?" Ethan walked further into the room, his expression filled with pain. He was standing too close to her now, and for the first time, Lauren noticed the raw vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't care anymore. We've been living in this nightmare for too long. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything. We're already losing ourselves." Lauren's breath caught in her throat. Losing themselves. It was a thought she hadn't dared to voice aloud, but it had crossed her mind time and again. They had both changed, become people they didn't recognize. The fear, the lies, the constant hiding. It had all started to tear them apart in ways they hadn't anticipated. "What are we supposed to do?" Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was afraid to hear the answer, but she needed to know. "What happens if we go public with the truth?" Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Finally he spoke, his words heavy with regret. "We can't go public. Not like this. The world isn't ready for what we've done. But we can't keep hiding either. We'll have to make sure no one finds out. Not yet. Not until we have a plan." Lauren's heart raced. A plan. How could they even think about a plan when everything felt so out of control? The walls were closing in on them. They were already running out of time. "Then what?" she pressed, trying to steady her voice, though it trembled in spite of her best efforts. "What do we do now?" Ethan took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in exhaustion. "We need to fix this. We need to find a way to put the pieces back together before it's too late." Lauren felt the weight of his words sink in, and for the first time in days, a glimmer of hope flickered inside her. Maybe there was a way out of this, a way to repair the damage they had caused. But the path ahead was unclear, uncertain. The truth, once revealed, couldn't be undone. And yet, there was no going back. They had already crossed a line, and there was no telling what the fallout would be. I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice breaking as she stepped closer to him. Ethan reached out, pulling her into an embrace. "You won't. We're in this together. No matter what happens." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the reality of their situation became clearer than ever. The truth had always been their enemy, but it was also the only thing that could set them free. They could no longer live in the shadows, hiding from what they had done. It was time to face the consequences, whatever they might be. And so, with a shared sense of resolve, they made a decision. They would take the first step, whatever it cost them. The truth was no longer something they could avoid. It was something they had to confront, together. The days that followed their decision were a blur of tense conversations, nervous glances, and the constant undercurrent of fear. Ethan and Lauren knew the truth had to come out, but they weren't prepared for how everything would change once it did. The pressure was unbearable, yet it was the only way forward. The secrecy that had bound them together was now the very thing threatening to tear them apart. It was late one evening when they finally agreed to meet the person who could help them, a lawyer who specialized in matters of this magnitude. It was clear to both of them that there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, in the open, and they had to prepare for the fallout. "I still can't believe we're doing this," Lauren said, her voice tense as they walked into the small, dimly lit office. The lawyer, a tall woman in her 40s, rose from behind her desk to greet them. Her sharp eyes studied them, taking in their unease with practiced precision. "Sit down," she said in a firm tone, motioning to the chairs in front of her desk. "You're about to make a decision that will change everything. You need to be ready for the consequences no matter what." Ethan and Lauren exchanged a brief, uncertain glance before sitting down. Lauren felt her palms sweating as she folded her hands in her lap. This was it. The moment they had been dreading. The truth was no longer just a weight on their hearts. It was an unstoppable force that would define the rest of their lives. "Tell me everything," the lawyer said, her voice softer now, but still firm. "You came to me because you need help. You've kept this secret for a long time, but it's time to face it head on. No more running." For the next hour, they recounted every detail of what had happened. How the accident occurred, the decision they had made to protect the secret, and how it had spiraled into something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. The lawyer listened intently, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the gravity of their situation. When they were finished, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze still fixed on them. "I understand the choice you made, but now we have to deal with the fallout. The law doesn't look kindly on what you've done, no matter your intentions. You'll be facing serious consequences. The key now is to minimize the damage." Lauren swallowed hard, her mind spinning. "What are we looking at? What happens now?" The lawyer's eyes softened, just for a moment. "There will be an investigation. People will question your actions, and there will be consequences, both legal and personal. Your lives will never be the same." Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tight with frustration. "We didn't mean for any of this to happen. We didn't think it would get this far." The lawyer nodded. "No one ever does. But the truth always catches up with you, eventually." As they left the lawyer's office, the weight of the world seemed to descend on them. Their lives, once so carefully controlled, were now in the hands of forces they could not control. The truth had always been their greatest fear, but now it was their only chance for redemption. Lauren glanced at Ethan as they walked out into the cool night air, her heart heavy with dread. What now? Ethan didn't answer at first. His eyes were fixed ahead, his expression distant, as if trying to make sense of everything. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and determined. "Now, we face it," he said. "Together." And with those words, they took their first steps into an uncertain future. They had no idea what awaited them, but for the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of clarity. The truth, while painful, was no longer something to fear. It was something they had to embrace, no matter the cost. The fallout from their decision came swiftly, faster than they could have anticipated. The investigation began within days, and the media soon caught wind of the story. The world, as they had known it, was slowly crumbling around them. Every aspect of their lives was scrutinized, every decision questioned. The once hidden truth had now been exposed, and there was no going back. But amid the chaos, Lauren and Ethan found something they hadn't expected: a sense of peace. The weight of their secret, the constant fear of being caught, had lifted. Yes, there would be consequences. Yes, their lives would be irrevocably changed. But they no longer had to carry the burden of deception. In the weeks that followed, they weathered the storm together. The consequences were indeed severe, both legal and personal, but they faced it all side by side, knowing that they had finally done the right thing. As the dust settled, Lauren looked at Ethan one last time, her heart finally at ease. "We made it through." Ethan nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "We did, and we're going to be okay." For the first time in a long while, Lauren allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. The truth had set them free, even if it had cost them everything. And with that, their journey was over. The pact that had bound them together, silent, fragile, and dangerous, was finally broken. And in its place, they found freedom.